Welcome to Lecture 10 of CSE 4635. In this lecture, we will be starting our JSP content, where we will be discussing its lifecycle, API, scripting elements, directives, standard actions, and comments. So let's begin. So what exactly do we understand by JSP? JSP, or Java Server Pages in its most basic form, is simply an HTML page with some Java code sprinkled in. So essentially, it is similar to an HTML page, with the difference being that it has some Java code inside it as well. Now we know that HTML itself allows only static content, but including Java code inside an HTML page enables us to include dynamic content in our web page. Now, you might be wondering, what is the difference between Servlet and JSP? Servlet and JSPs complement each other. Servlets are used as server-side controller and to communicate with model classes, whereas JSPs can be used for presentation layer. So we can say that JSP is an extension of the servlet technology. This statement becomes more true because whenever JSP page is included in your project, the web container, while executing your project, will convert the JSP pages into corresponding servlets and then run the code inside the JSP pages to generate an output. These things will become more clear when we look at the life cycle of a JSP page. So let's look into that. The first phase in the lifecycle of a JSP page is the translation phase. In this phase, the web container parses the JSP pages and translates them to corresponding servlet source code. For example, your home.jsp page will become something like home_jsp.java file. Now you will not be able to see this home_jsp.java file inside your project. This will all be happening in the background. If you really want to take a look at the home_jsp.java file, in that case, you will have to look at the home directory of your web container. That is, if you're using Tomcat as your web container, in that case, you will have to look under your Tomcat's home directory and search for your home_jsp.java file. The next phase in the lifecycle of JSP is compilation phase. After translation, the web container simply compiles the generated servlet source file into a class file. After the class file has been generated, it will be loaded into memory, and its lifecycle, that is the lifecycle of a JSP page, will become similar to the lifecycle of a servlet. Then we have the instance creation phase, in which the JSP class, after being loaded into memory, its object is instantiated by the container. The next phase we have is the initialization phase. In the initialization phase, the JSP class is initialized and it transforms from a normal class to a servlet. After initialization, the servlet context and servlet config objects become accessible to the JSP class. The next phase is request processing phase. So for every client request that comes for the JSP page, a new thread is spawned with servlet request and servlet response to process and generate the corresponding HTML responses for the client's requests. The last phase in the lifecycle of JSP is the destroy phase, which is essentially the same as the destroy phase of your servlet class. So in this destroy method, or in this destroy phase, if any resources had been opened up by your JSP page, then those resources can be closed. Now let's take a look at the API that is used by JSP pages. JSP works with two main interfaces, the JSP page interface and the HTTP JSP page interface. The JSP page interface has two methods, public void JSP init and public void JSP destroy. The JSP init method is the same as the init method of servlets. That is, it is invoked only once at the beginning of the lifecycle of JSP pages, and it is responsible for initializing your JSP page. The next method, that is the JSP destroy method, is also invoked only once, but it is invoked at the end of the JSP's lifecycle. It can be used to perform cleanup operation, as we have mentioned earlier. The HTTP JSP page interface has only one method, and that is public void underscore JSP service method. As you can see, the underscore JSP service method takes two inputs as parameters, your HTTP servlet request object and HTTP servlet response object. This is the method that is called each time a request is received by your JSP page. So essentially, this method is responsible for handling or for processing your request, that is, your client's request. The underscore at the beginning of this method's name indicates that this method cannot be overridden. These three methods are very important in the lifecycle of a JSP page, and combinedly, they are called the lifecycle methods of JSP. A JSP page also works with some core classes as well. These classes are classes like JSP Writer class, Page Context class, JSP Factory class, and so on. We will not be taking a look at those classes for now. All the core JSP interfaces and classes are defined in your javax.servlet.jsp package. Now let's look at some of the nuts and bolts of a JSP page. The syntactic elements in a JSP page include things like your directives, declarations, scriptlets, expressions, JSP actions, and comment. Directives are used to give special instructions to the container while the JSP page is getting translated to servlet source code. Declarations are used to define class-wide variables and methods, which will be used in your JSP page. Scriptlets are blocks of code or blocks of Java code inside your JSP page. Expressions are shorthand notations that replace the out.print method inside your JSP page. JSP actions are tags that affect the runtime behavior of the JSP and response sent back to the client. And finally, comment is simple comments that you can use inside your JSP pages. Now there are some implicit objects inside your JSP page as well. There are a total of 9 implicit objects. These implicit objects are out, request, response, config, application, session, page context, page, and exception. Now we call these objects implicit objects because you do not have to create or declare these objects separately inside your JSP page. All these objects will be accessible to your JSP page by default. So you do not have to create or define these objects. Okay? As for these syntactic elements, we will be taking a deeper look into them in our following slides. Now let's take a look at scriptlets. Scriptlet is a block of Java code inside a JSP page which is executed during the request processing time. There can be multiple scriptlets or multiple blocks of Java code inside your JSP page. Scriptlets, or these blocks of Java code, are written inside your angle bracket % tag. Any code that is written inside this scriptlet tags go into the underscore JSP service method. So whenever your web container converts your JSP pages into corresponding servlets, these blocks of Java code or these scriptlets go inside the service method of that servlet. Okay? They are therefore processed for every request that your JSP page receives. Now, as for an example, this is a JSP page, and inside the body tag of this JSP page, you can see that we have defined a scriptlet tag. So inside the scriptlet tag, we have written some Java code. Now, for our first code, we are simply printing the name of an employee that we have received as a form parameter in some other previous page. Similarly, we are also printing the title of this employee that we have received from some form in some previous page. Next, as for an example, we have also defined a variable called z. We have incremented its value by 1. And finally, we are printing the value of this variable inside our JSP page. So in this way, you can write or define JSP scriptlets inside your JSP page. Another important thing to note in this example is that we are using the implicit object out and the implicit object request inside this scriptlet. Now, if you remember, implicit objects do not have to be defined separately. And as you can see, we have not defined out or request objects anywhere in this scriptlet, right? So we are directly using the out object and the request object without defining or declaring them. All right. Now let's take a look at JSP Expressions. An expression is a shorthand notation that sends the evaluated Java expression back to the client in the form of a string. Since most of times we print dynamic data inside our JSP page by using out.print method, JSP expressions make our life easier by providing a shortcut to replace this out.print method. JSP expressions are written inside angle bracket %equals sign. Notice that anything that is written inside an expression tag is sent as a parameter to the out.print method. That is, JSP expressions basically replace out.print method. So if we take a look at an example here, you can see we have a JSP page, and inside the body of this JSP page, we have created a scriptlet where we are creating a string variable called username, and we are giving it the value anas. Now, when we render this JSP page on the client's side, we only want to print something like welcome and then the value of this username. Now, to do that, we are using JSP expressions. As you can see, inside the JSP expression tag here, we have written the name username. So whenever this JSP page is going to be processed, this JSP expression is going to evaluate the value of this expression and convert it to anas. So all the client will see is welcome anas. Okay, so this is how JSP expressions can be used to evaluate Java variables. Now, JSP expressions can be used to evaluate variables like this, or it can also be used to evaluate methods. So if your method returned any variable or any value, then that method can also be used inside JSP expressions like this. Okay. Similar to JSP Scriptlets, expressions also go inside your JSP service method. However, there are some key differences between expressions and scriptlets. Notice that scriptlets can contain multiple lines of Java code, and they always end with a semicolon. However, in case of expressions, they do not end with semicolon, and they only contain a variable name or a method name. All right? Now we take a look at JSP Declarations. A declaration is a block of Java code which is used to define class-wide variables and methods in the generated servlet. These variables and methods are initialized whenever the JSP page is initialized. They do not go inside the underscore JSP service method. That is, the code written inside the JSP declaration tag is placed outside the service method of the auto-generated corresponding servlet for this JSP. So it does not get any memory at each request. It only gets initialized only once at the beginning of the JSP's lifecycle. As for an example of JSP declarations, consider this JSP page here, and inside this JSP page, we have created a declaration tag here, and inside this declaration, we are creating a variable or a string variable called name, and we have assigned it the value anas. We have also created a function inside this declaration tag, and the name of this function is return name, and all it does is return the name string variable. Okay. Now, inside our h1 header tag here, we want to print something like welcome anas. And for that, what we are doing is we have simply written welcome, and then we have used a JSP expression to evaluate the function. Okay, so whenever this function is going to be evaluated, we are simply going to get the value anas. So all the client will see in his web page is the message welcome anas. Okay, so this since this method and this variable are defined inside the declaration tag, this will only be initialized once at the beginning of the JSP page's lifecycle. Even if this page is requested 10 times, this variable and this method will not be initialized 10 times. They will only be initialized only once at the beginning of this JSP page's lifecycle. Okay? Next, we take a look at JSP directives. JSP directives are used to send messages to the web container, which essentially tells the web container how to translate a JSP page into the corresponding servlet. JSP directives start with angle bracket %@ and ends with angle bracket and ends with % angle bracket. There are three main directives when it comes to JSP directives. These directives are page directive, include directive, and the taglib directive. The page directive is used to define attributes that apply to an entire JSP page. The include directive is used for including other static resources at compilation time. So for example, if I want to include the content of a file called header.html inside my JSP page, then I can use this include directive. Lastly, we have taglib directive, which is used for including custom tag libraries. Now, when it comes to tag libraries and custom tag libraries, those are completely different concepts, which we will be taking a look at later on. Now, we have mentioned that this page directive defines some attributes that apply to entire JSP page, right? Now, there are some predefined attributes that can be defined by this page directive. These attributes are import, content type, extends, info, buffer, and so on. All these attributes have their own functions that can be performed inside the JSP page. For example, you can use the import attribute to import any Java package that you wish to use inside your JSP page. Similarly, you can use the content type attribute to define the type of content that you will be printing inside your JSP page. And all these other attributes have their own functions as well. As for the attributes of the include directive, there is only one. The name of that attribute is file. This attribute takes the value of the file name which you want to include in your JSP page. So if we take a look at an example, consider this as a JSP page, and inside this JSP page, inside the body tag, I am including the content of header.html file by using the include directive. Now, if you remember, the include directive has only one attribute called file, and the value of this attribute is the name of the file that you're trying to include. Okay, so since I have written this include file statement at the very beginning of my body tag, what will happen is the content inside this header.html file will be printed first in my JSP page, and then the remaining content will be displayed. So after I have included this header.html file, I have imported the java.util.date package by using the page directive. And for doing this, I am using the import attribute of the page directive. All right. After that, you can see I have created a JSP declaration tag. And inside this declaration tag, I have defined a string variable called name, and I have assigned it the value anas. And also, I have created a function called return name, which simply returns the value of this variable. Okay. Now, again, since I have created this variable and this method inside the declaration tag, both this variable and this method is going to be initialized only once at the beginning of this JSP's lifecycle. After that, I have an h1 tag where I am printing today's date, and for that I am using a JSP expression. So since I am using new date constructor inside this JSP expression, I will simply get the value of today's date as well as the current time. Okay. Next, inside another h1 header tag, I have written welcome, and then I have used another JSP expression tag to call the value or to call the function return name. So after this function has been evaluated, all I will be getting is welcome anas. So after this JSP page is going to be processed, the client will see something like this. So the first message here, developer name anas jawad, is coming from the header.html file that I have included at the top of my body tag. Next, I have the message today's date is, and then we have an expression tag, right? So for this line here, we are getting this message. Today's date is Sunday, November 01. And finally, my last H1 header tag, which simply printed welcome and then evaluated the expression return name, is printing the message welcome on us. Okay, so this is what the client will see after this JSP page has been processed. Now, on the client side, even if the client wants to inspect the content of this page, he or she will not be seeing any of the JSP expressions or JSP scriptlets that we have written inside our JSP page. All he will be seeing is some constant values, right? So this is a big advantage when it comes to using JSP. So even if we use expressions, scriptlets, declarations, or anything else inside our JSP page, the final page that the client will see will not contain any of those. They will only contain the processed information that has been generated from that JSP page. Okay? JSP standard actions are tags that affect the runtime behavior of the JSP page and the response generated by the JSP page, which is sent back to the client. Standard actions are used for including static or dynamic resources at request time. There are many JSP action tags or elements. Each action tag is used to perform some specific task. The action tags are used to control the flow between pages and to use Java beans. Now, if you're wondering what a Java bean is, don't worry. We will be taking a look at Java bean and its details later on. Some of the JSP action tags are given below. So as you can see, we have JSP forward action tag, include action tag, useBean action tag, and so on. If you want a more detailed look into these action tags, I will provide a link in the description, in the video description, which you can follow to get a more detailed idea about the functions of this action tag. So if we take a look at an example of using action tags, this is the same JSP page that we have seen in our last example. The only difference is we have used this JSP include action tag to include this page footer.jsp. Okay, so we are using the include action tag, which has an attribute or parameter called page, and this attribute takes the value of the name of the page which we are trying to include into our JSP page. So this footer.jsp page has only a single line of message which says copyright none. And so after all the content has been printed here, this footer.jsp content will be printed at the end of all this content. So after this JSP page has been rendered, this is the output that we will be getting on the client side. So we have our developer name message, we have our welcome on us message, we have our today's date message, and finally we have the message copyright none, which was included inside the footer.jsp page. Now you might be wondering when we should be using the at directive or the include directive to include additional static resources, and when we should be using the JSP include action tag to include additional resources. So let's take a look at the differences between the include directive and the include action tag. So in case of the include directive, the included resource is loaded during the JSP translation time. However, in case of the action tag, the include action tag, the resource is loaded during the request time. And so any change on the included resource will not be visible until the JSP file is compiled again in case of the include directive. However, the change in the included resource will be visible in next request in case of the include action tag. Now, include directive is a static import, whereas the include action is a dynamic import. The include directive uses file attribute to specify resource to be included. On the other hand, the action tag include uses the page attribute for the same purpose. So in this case, in this example here, for the directive include, we are using the file attribute to include the header.html file, whereas in case of the include action tag, we are using the page attribute to include the header.html file. Okay. We have come to the last topic for today, which is JSP Comments. Now, JSP supports both HTML style comments, like so, as well as supports JSP style comments like this. Now, if you're wondering which comment type you should be using in your JSP file, it depends on your scenario. So always use JSP style comments unless you specifically want the comments to appear in the HTML that results from serving a JSP page. What this means is if you use JSP style comments, then the client will not be able to see those comments inside the generated web page, even if he tries to inspect that web page. On the other hand, if you use HTML style comments like this, then the client will be able to see those comments if he tries to inspect the content of that web page. JSP style comments are converted by the JSP page engine into Java comments in the source code of the corresponding servlet that implements the JSP page. Therefore, JSP style comments do not appear in the output produced by the JSP page when it runs. HTML style comments pass through the JSP page engine unmodified, and so they appear in the HTML source that is passed to the request client. JSP style comments do not increase the size of the document that results from the JSP page, but it is useful to enhance the readability of the JSP page source and to simplify debugging the servlet generated from the JSP page. So that is it for this lecture. If you have any question regarding any of the topics that we have discussed today, then let me know. I will try to answer your questions to the best of my abilities. So I will see you next time. Take care and stay safe.